Muslim family refuse service, then they buy the entire franchise. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. A warm evening breeze drifted through the bustling streets as the Rahman family stepped out of their car and onto the sidewalk, the neon lights of the city reflecting off the glass storefronts. The air was filled with the enticing aroma of grilled meats and freshly baked bread, and their youngest, Ayan, a bright-eyed 10-year-old, inhaled deeply, his excitement unmistakable. "Baba, I'm starving. This place smells amazing," Ayan exclaimed, tugging at his father's sleeve. His father, Omar Rahman, chuckled, his deep voice calm and reassuring. "Patience, Habibi. We'll eat soon." He adjusted his blazer, his well-groomed beard adding to his dignified presence. His wife, Layla, stood beside him, her hijab draped elegantly over her shoulders, while their teenage daughter, Sanaa, scrolled through her phone, barely containing a smile at her brother's enthusiasm. They had spent the entire day exploring the city, and now dinner at a popular chain restaurant seemed like the perfect way to wrap up the night. The glowing sign above the door welcomed them in, and with warm chatter they entered, greeted by the sound of sizzling food and the low hum of conversation from other patrons. Inside, the restaurant was modern yet cozy, filled with a mix of customers, families, students, and business professionals. The counter stretched across the back wall, where a young cashier, no older than 20, stood taking orders. The Rahman family approached, their footsteps light, their presence unassuming. "Assalamu alaikum," Omar greeted with a polite nod as they reached the counter. The cashier hesitated, her fingers hovering over the register. Her smile faltered. A shadow of uncertainty passed over her face before she glanced toward the back of the restaurant, her movements stiff, as if unsure of how to proceed. Omar frowned slightly, exchanging a glance with Layla. From a door marked "Employees Only," a man emerged briskly. He was broad-shouldered, middle-aged, with a well-pressed uniform and a name tag that read Manager, Craig Henshaw. His eyes landed on the Rahman family, scanning them with unmistakable disdain before his lips curled into an unpleasant smirk. "Can I help you?" His voice was flat, clipped, lacking the warmth he had extended to the previous customers. Omar stepped forward. "We'd like to order dinner." His tone remained pleasant, unwavering. Craig crossed his arms, his smirk deepening. "Sorry, we're closed." Sanaa frowned, glancing at the large digital menu board that clearly displayed the restaurant's operating hours. "But the sign says you're open until midnight?" She looked around, other customers were still waiting for their orders. Craig let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "For most people, yeah. But not for you." Ayan, still young enough to believe in the fairness of the world, furrowed his brows. "Why not?" His innocent voice broke through the tension. Craig's smirk twisted. "We have the right to refuse service to anyone. And we don't serve," he gestured vaguely toward Omar's attire, then to Layla's hijab. "People like you." A heavy silence settled over the restaurant. Layla's fingers instinctively curled around her purse strap. Sanaa's hands clenched at her sides, her face burning with humiliation. Omar exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just enough for Layla to notice. "Excuse me?" Omar's voice was dangerously calm. Craig tilted his head, his condescending smirk unwavering. "You heard me. We don't want trouble. Take your family and go somewhere else." Ayan, now grasping the reality of the situation, looked up at his father, confused. His young mind couldn't quite process why a man would speak to them like this. Omar, ever composed, let out a slow breath. He was not one to create a scene. He had spent years building himself as a respected businessman, teaching his children the values of dignity, patience, and resilience. But this wasn't just about him. It was about his family. About every person who had ever faced this kind of hatred disguised as policy. He set his shoulders, ready to respond, when a voice cut through the tension. A woman, likely in her late 40s, stood near the counter, her tray in hand. "That's ridiculous," she said, her expression tight with disapproval. "They're just here for a meal." Craig turned toward her, his smirk slipping. "Mind your business, lady," the woman scoffed. "I will when you start treating people like human beings." She set her tray down with a loud clatter, making a few other patrons glance their way. Sanaa's heart pounded. Someone was standing up for them. But before hope could settle in, Craig took a step forward, his demeanor darkening. "You want to eat here or not?" His voice was low, threatening. The woman hesitated. She looked at the Rahman family, then back at Craig. And then she sat down. Defeated. She had tried. But she had backed down. A sick feeling churned in Sanaa's stomach. Craig turned back to Omar. I'll give you one last chance to walk out on your own. Layla exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on Ayan's shoulders. Omar glanced at his son, then his daughter, then back to Craig. He nodded once. Come on, he said, his voice firm. We're leaving. Ayan looked heartbroken as they turned away, stepping toward the exit. Craig let out a mocking laugh, shaking his head as he watched them leave. That's what I thought. Sanaa's fists clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight back. But as they stepped onto the sidewalk, Omar's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. A message. His expression remained unreadable as he read it. Layla touched his arm, concerned. Omar? What is it? He looked up. A reminder. His lips curved into the slightest smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. That every action has a consequence? Sanaa blinked. What do you mean? Omar slid his phone back into his blazer pocket, exhaling. It means they'll regret this. Layla studied her husband. Omar Rahman was not a man of impulsive reactions. He was a man of strategy. And Craig Henshaw had just made the worst mistake of his life. The drive home was quiet. Ayan had fallen asleep in the back seat, his small head resting against Sanaa's shoulder. Layla stared out the window, her fingers tracing patterns on her lap, deep in thought. Sanaa, however, couldn't contain her frustration. We should have done something, she muttered, crossing her arms. Omar's hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, his expression unreadable. Like what? Layla asked gently. Sanaa turned to her. I don't know. Called the police? Made a scene? That man humiliated us in front of everyone, Mama. He told us we weren't welcome, like we were animals. Layla sighed. And what would that have changed? Sanaa shook her head, feeling powerless. Omar remained silent, his focus locked on the road. When they finally pulled into their driveway, he parked, took a deep breath, and turned to face them. Do you really think I'm going to let this go? His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it that made Sanaa pause. Layla's eyes narrowed slightly. Omar, what are you planning? Omar simply smiled, but there was something unreadable in his expression. He opened his door and stepped out. Come inside. I need to make some calls. Sanaa and Layla exchanged a glance before following him inside. Omar settled into his home office, his fingers gliding over the sleek black desk as he pulled out his phone. He leaned back in his chair and dialed a number. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. Rahman. It's been a while. Omar allowed himself a small smirk. It has, hasn't it? How's business, Marcus? Booming, thanks to some smart investments. What about you? Omar's eyes darkened slightly as he exhaled. I need your help with something. There was a pause. Go on. Omar leaned forward. There's a franchise location I need to acquire. Fast. Another silence, followed by a low chuckle. Let me guess. Someone pissed you off? Omar smiled thinly. Something like that. Which company? Omar tapped his fingers against the desk. Iron Grill. The one on 54th Street. Marcus let out a whistle. Interesting choice. I heard that place is struggling. You could probably get it for cheap. That's the plan. Can you set up a meeting with their corporate office? I can do better than that, Marcus replied smoothly. I have a connection with the regional owner. I'll call him tonight and get things rolling. Omar nodded. Good. I want the paperwork in motion immediately. You're really going all in on this, huh? Marcus sounded amused. Omar's expression turned steely. This is about more than just business. There was a pause, then Marcus let out a knowing sigh. Understood. I'll call you back in a few hours. Omar hung up, his gaze flickering to the family photo on his desk. His legacy, his children, he wasn't going to let this go unanswered. Later that evening, Layla entered the office, watching as Omar scanned through documents on his laptop. So, she said carefully, crossing her arms. You're really doing this? Omar didn't look up. Yes. Layla exhaled. Omar, I understand why, but is this really necessary? People like Craig, racists, bigots, they don't change. He'll just move on to someone else. Omar leaned back in his chair, looking up at her. Then we'll make sure he can't. We aren't just buying that location, Layla. We're going to change how it operates. We'll replace him, hire people who actually respect their customers, and send a message. Layla studied her husband for a long moment. She knew that once Omar Rahman set his mind to something, there was no changing it. She sighed, shaking her head. I married a very stubborn man. Omar chuckled. You married a man who doesn't let injustice slide. She smiled faintly. That too. 3 days later, the Iron Grill corporate office received an offer. The franchise owner, Mr. Whitmore, a man in his 60s with graying hair and sharp business instincts, read through the documents in his office, his fingers drumming against the desk. His assistant, Rachel, stood beside him, adjusting her glasses. "This is a very generous offer, sir." Whitmore exhaled. "It is. Which makes me suspicious." He leaned back in his chair. "Why would someone be so eager to buy out a single struggling location?" Rachel hesitated. "The buyer is Omar Rahman. He's a high-level investor, owns multiple businesses. He has the capital to pull this off easily." Whitmore stroked his chin. "Rahman?" He flipped through the papers. Then realization struck. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Muslim name." Rachel stiffened. "Sir?" Whitmore's expression turned thoughtful. "Wasn't there some kind of incident at that location recently? Something about a manager refusing service?" Rachel hesitated. "I believe so. It wasn't officially reported, but it did circulate on social media." Whitmore let out a low chuckle. "Interesting. Very interesting." He tapped the papers. "Call him. Let's schedule a meeting." Rachel nodded and exited the room. Whitmore smirked, adjusting his tie. "Let's see what this Rahman guy is really up to." The next morning, Omar walked into the Iron Grill corporate office, dressed in a tailored suit, his presence commanding yet calm. He was met by Rachel, who escorted him to a large conference room where Whitmore was already seated. The older man stood, extending a hand. "Mr. Rahman, pleasure to meet you." Omar shook his hand firmly. "Likewise." Whitmore gestured to the seat across from him. "Have a seat. Let's talk business." Omar sat, placing a folder neatly on the table. Whitmore studied him for a moment before smiling. "I'll be honest, Mr. Rahman. Your offer is generous. More than the property is worth, really. Which makes me wonder, why this location? There are far more profitable investments you could make." Omar met his gaze evenly. "I have my reasons." Whitmore chuckled. "I figured you'd say that. Let's cut to the chase. This wouldn't have anything to do with that little incident involving Craig Henshaw, would it?" Omar's expression remained neutral. "You tell me?" Whitmore leaned forward. "Look, I'm a businessman. I don't care about politics, social issues, or personal vendettas. I care about numbers. And from where I'm sitting, you're offering me a deal I'd be a fool to refuse." He folded his hands together. "So, let's do business." Omar nodded, a small, satisfied smile crossing his lips. "Let's." By the end of the meeting, the deal was sealed. In 2 weeks, Omar Rahman would officially own the restaurant Craig Henshaw had once controlled. As Omar left the office, stepping out into the crisp morning air, he pulled out his phone and sent a single message to Marcus. "It's done. Time for phase 2. A smirk played on his lips as he put the phone away. Craig Henshaw had no idea what was coming. 2 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, negotiations, and final approvals. By the time everything was finalized, Omar Rahman officially owned the Iron Grill location on 54th Street. He had waited for this moment, ensuring that every detail was in place before making his next move. Now it was time. Craig Henshaw was still managing the restaurant, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. The morning of the takeover, Craig walked into the restaurant as usual, holding his coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. He barely glanced at his employees as they prepped for the day, moving through the motions of a job he thought was secure. That changed the moment the doors swung open. A group of well-dressed business professionals walked in, carrying clipboards and official-looking documents. Craig blinked in confusion, setting his coffee down. "Who the hell are you?" The lead executive, a tall woman in a navy blue suit, pulled out a folder and handed it to him. "Mr. Henshaw, I suggest you read this carefully." Craig's brows furrowed as he skimmed the paperwork. The longer he read, the more his face drained of color. His entire body stiffened. What is this?" he stammered. The woman folded her arms. "New ownership agreement. As of today, this location is under new management. Effective immediately." Craig looked up, his mouth opening, but then he saw him. Omar Rahman walked in, calm, collected, and in full control. Craig's stomach dropped. Omar didn't have to say a word. His mere presence was enough. Craig's hands trembled as he looked between Omar and the woman in the suit. This is a joke, right?" His voice wasn't as strong as he wanted it to be. Omar finally spoke. "No joke. I own this place now." The restaurant fell into silence. Employees stopped what they were doing. Customers near the counter looked up. The entire space seemed to hold its breath. Craig gritted his teeth. "You can't do this." Omar raised an eyebrow. "Can't I?" Craig slammed the folder down. This is because of what happened that night, isn't it? His voice was louder now, desperate. You're doing this to get back at me? Omar remained unshaken. No, I'm doing this to fix something that was broken. Craig let out a bitter laugh. You really think you can just waltz in here and run things better than I did? Omar took a step forward, his expression unreadable. I don't think. I know. Craig's fist clenched. You're making a mistake. Omar's lips twitched slightly. The only mistake was allowing someone like you to be in charge for this long. The woman in the navy suit cleared her throat. Mr. Henshaw, let me be clear. Your employment is terminated. As of this moment. Craig's eyes snapped to her. You can't fire me. You need me to run this place. Omar chuckled lightly. No, we don't. Craig looked around, searching for support. Some employees looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. No one stood up for him. Omar held out a folder. You can leave quietly, or we can have security escort you out. Craig's face turned red. You smug. Before he could finish, a security guard stepped forward. Craig's breath hitched. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his pride battling reality. Then, after several tense seconds, he snatched the folder from Omar's hand and stormed toward the door. As he reached the exit, he turned back, his glare full of hatred. You'll regret this, Rahman? Omar met his gaze without flinching. No, Craig. You will? The door slammed behind him. For the first time, Iron Grill was free of Craig Henshaw. The transition was swift and immediate. Under Omar's leadership, heavy checkmark all employees were retrained to prioritize respect and inclusivity. Heavy checkmark the discriminatory No Muslims Allowed sign was ripped off the window and publicly burned. Heavy checkmark new hires reflected the diversity of the city, people of all races, religions, and backgrounds. Heavy checkmark the menu was expanded, featuring halal-certified options to make the restaurant welcoming for everyone. The community noticed. The very people Craig had pushed away began returning. Business boomed. Iron Grill was no longer just another restaurant. It was a symbol of change. And Craig? Craig could only watch from the outside. One evening, just a month after the takeover, Omar sat at his usual table, sipping tea as the restaurant buzzed around him. Sanaa sat across from him, watching the packed dining area. I still can't believe we own this place now. Omar chuckled. Neither can Craig. Sanaa smirked. Do you think he's still bitter? As if on cue, a shadow appeared outside. They both turned. Craig Henshaw stood just beyond the glass window, staring in. His clothes were disheveled, his expression cold. Omar met his gaze, unbothered. Craig's jaw tightened. He turned and disappeared into the night. Sanaa exhaled, shaking her head. Pathetic. Omar took another sip of tea. That's what happens when you think hate makes you powerful. Sanaa looked at him, thoughtful. And what makes you powerful, Baba? Omar smiled. Patience. And knowing when to act. The next morning, an article spread like wildfire. From exclusion to ownership. The Muslim family who took over a restaurant that refused them. The story went viral. Heavy checkmark local news stations covered it. Heavy checkmark social media exploded with support. Heavy checkmark messages poured in from people who had faced similar discrimination. Omar, despite the attention, remained humble. This was never about revenge, he told a reporter. This was about proving that hate has no place in our businesses, in our communities, or in our lives. Iron Grill's success skyrocketed. Meanwhile, Craig Henshaw's life fell apart. Weeks later, as Omar left the restaurant late at night, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on the curb. Craig. The former manager looked lost, staring down at the sidewalk. For a brief moment, Omar considered walking past him. But instead he stopped. Craig looked up, startled. Omar met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. I hope you learned something from all of this, Craig. Craig scoffed, looking away. Yeah. That people like you always win. Omar sighed. No. That hate never does. Without another word, he walked away, leaving Craig in the past where he belonged. And with that, Omar Rahman closed the chapter on Craig Henshaw, a man who once thought he had the power to decide who belonged, only to learn he never had any power at all. Weeks passed and the transformation of Iron Grill was undeniable. What had once been a place tainted by bigotry was now a thriving, diverse establishment, one that welcomed people of all backgrounds. The community took notice. Customers who had once ignored the injustice now praised the change. Reviews flooded in, social media was buzzing, and for the first time in years the restaurant was actually profitable. But not everyone was happy. Craig Henshaw had disappeared from the public eye, but his resentment hadn't faded. And Omar knew that men like Craig didn't let things go. One evening, after closing hours, Omar sat in his office at the restaurant, reviewing financial reports. Business was booming, but he still believed in personally managing every detail. Layla walked in, placing a cup of tea beside him. "You've been working all night," she said, concern in her voice. Omar glanced up, smiling. "Just making sure everything is running smoothly." Layla shook her head playfully. "It's running better than ever. You've done what you set out to do, Omar. Maybe it's time to relax just a little?" Omar leaned back in his chair. "I will. Just a little longer." Layla sat across from him, studying him carefully. "You're still thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked. Omar's expression didn't change. "Craig?" He let out a slow breath. "I'd be a fool not to." Layla frowned. "You already won, Omar. He's gone. He lost everything." Omar looked thoughtful. "Men like Craig don't just disappear. They fester. They wait." Layla sighed. "And what are you going to do? Spend the rest of your life worrying about a bitter man with no job and no influence?" Omar smirked. "No. But I will be prepared." That night, as Omar locked up and stepped outside, a shadow moved near the alleyway. He turned, his instincts sharp. Craig Henshaw stepped forward. Omar didn't flinch. Craig looked disheveled, his eyes sunken, his clothes wrinkled. "You ruined my life, Rahman," he muttered, his voice raw with hatred. Omar folded his arms. "No, Craig. You did that yourself." Craig scoffed. "I had a career. A business. I built that place up and you came in and stole it from me?" Omar raised an eyebrow. "Stole it? You mean the business that was failing? The one you were running into the ground with your outdated mentality?" Craig's fists clenched. "You think you're better than me?" Omar's expression didn't waver. "I don't have to think, Craig. The results speak for themselves." Craig let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't belong here," he spat. "You people." Omar took a step forward, his presence imposing. "Careful, Craig. Choose your next words wisely." Craig's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. For the first time he realized Omar wasn't afraid of him. And that terrified him. Omar's voice lowered. "You see, the difference between us is simple. You thrive on hate. I build from it. And that's why you'll never win." Craig's lips curled. "This isn't over." Omar smiled faintly. "It was over the moment you put that sign up, Craig." Craig glared at him for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. Omar exhaled, watching him go. He knew that wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. But Craig Henshaw no longer had any power. And that made all the difference. The next few months were the best in Iron Grill's history. Heavy checkmark revenue skyrocketed. Heavy checkmark media continued covering the transformation. Heavy checkmark more businesses reached out to partner with Omar. But the best part? Heavy checkmark the customers. Families, students, and working professionals, all from different backgrounds, felt welcome. The restaurant that had once refused service to a Muslim family was now a safe space for everyone. Omar sat in his usual booth, sipping tea as Sanaa and Ayan laughed over their meals. Layla smiled at her husband. "You made this happen." Omar looked around, content. "We all did." Layla squeezed his hand. "So what's next?" Omar chuckled. "Let's just enjoy this moment first." Sanaa smirked. "Baba, I give it a week before you start your next big project." Omar laughed. "Fine. Maybe a week and a half." The family laughed, the restaurant alive with warmth and joy. The battle had been fought. The message had been sent. And justice had been served. Months had passed since Craig Henshaw had been removed from Iron Grill, but the impact of his downfall lingered like a ghost in the city's memory. People still whispered about the racist manager who lost everything, about how poetic justice had unfolded right before their eyes. But for Omar, life moved forward. His restaurant was thriving. His family was happier than ever. And yet, in the back of his mind, he knew Craig wasn't done. Hate, when left unchecked, had a way of festering. And sure enough, it did. It started with a smear campaign. Fake reviews flooded online platforms. Heavy checkmark, the new management is a disaster. Heavy checkmark, they only cater to their own kind. Heavy checkmark, food quality has gone downhill. Avoid this place. Omar wasn't naive. He recognized coordinated attacks when he saw them. Sanaa burst into his office one evening, phone in hand. "Baba, have you seen this? Someone's spreading lies about the restaurant." Omar took her phone and scrolled through the reviews. He let out a slow breath, his face calm but thoughtful. "Craig?" Layla frowned from where she stood by the door. "You think it's him? Who else?" Omar muttered, tossing the phone onto his desk. "We can report them," Sanaa suggested, her fists clenched. No need, Omar said smoothly. They want us to panic. We won't give them that. Sanaa frowned. But what if it affects business? Omar smiled slightly. Then we let our customers speak for us. That weekend, Omar launched a customer appreciation event. Heavy checkmark discounts for families. Heavy checkmark free meals for the first 50 customers. Heavy checkmark a community spotlight on social media featuring loyal patrons. The response? Overwhelming. Heavy checkmark loyal customers flooded in, drowning out the fake reviews with genuine praise. Heavy checkmark social media buzzed with videos of happy customers. Heavy checkmark within days the smear campaign collapsed. Craig's attempt to sabotage Omar's business had failed spectacularly, and he knew it. Late one night after the restaurant had closed, Omar stepped outside to get some air. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in a soft amber glow from the streetlights. That's when he heard it, a rustling near the dumpster. His muscles tensed. He turned. Craig stood in the shadows. His once pristine uniform was replaced by worn-out clothes. His hair was unkempt, his face sunken with bitterness. Omar didn't flinch. You again, he said flatly. Craig stepped forward, his eyes filled with venom. You think you're untouchable, don't you? Craig hissed. You think you won? Omar folded his arms. I don't think, Craig. I know. Craig scoffed, shaking his head. You ruined me. Omar's gaze darkened. No. You did that yourself the moment you decided hate was more important than success. Craig took another step forward, his body tense. You humiliated me. Omar exhaled. No, Craig. You humiliated yourself. Silence stretched between them. For a moment, Omar almost felt pity. Almost. Then Craig's eyes flickered with something dangerous. This isn't over, he muttered. Omar's patience snapped. He stepped forward, his voice low, unshaken. Yes, Craig. It is. Craig flinched. You lost your job. You lost your power. And now you've lost your dignity. You can blame me all you want, but deep down you know the truth. Craig's jaw clenched. You were never powerful. You were just a man hiding behind a uniform and a name tag. And now? Omar gestured around them. You're nothing. Craig's breath came out sharp. His hands twitched. But he didn't attack. Because deep down he knew Omar was right. With a final glare, Craig turned and disappeared into the night. And just like that he was gone. For good. The following morning, Omar sat with his family at the restaurant enjoying breakfast. Sanaa scrolled through her phone, grinning. Baba, look. Someone made a video about Iron Grill's transformation. It's going viral. Omar took the phone and watched the footage. Heavy checkmark before and after shots of the restaurant. Heavy checkmark clips of happy customers. Heavy checkmark a final frame showing Omar's new management turning it into a success story. Ayan beamed. Does this mean we won, Baba? Omar smiled, ruffling his son's hair. We didn't just win, Habibi. We changed something for the better. Layla squeezed his hand. So, what's next? Omar chuckled. How about we enjoy this moment for a little while? Sanaa smirked. You always say that. And then you start your next project within a week. Omar laughed. Okay, maybe 2 weeks this time. The family laughed together, the restaurant filled with warmth, love, and a sense of victory. Because this wasn't just about one business. This was about proving that hate never wins. And Omar Rahman had done just that. The sun was setting over the city as Iron Grill buzzed with life. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air, the scent of grilled meats and freshly baked bread wafting through the restaurant. At a corner table, Omar Rahman sat with his family, watching the success they had built together. Ayan was devouring a plate of fries, Sanaa was texting her friends, and Layla was sipping tea, a small smile on her lips. For the first time in months, Omar allowed himself to breathe. The battle had been fought. The past was behind them. And the future belonged to them. The next morning, Omar walked through the restaurant before opening hours, checking in on his staff. Smiling employees prepped the kitchen. New hires greeted one another, laughing and excited to start their shifts. Iron Grill had become a place of opportunity. A far cry from what Craig Henshaw had once turned it into. Omar stood near the entrance, watching as the first customers of the day began to arrive. A young Muslim couple walked in hand. A black family followed, their children giggling as they pointed at the menu. An elderly couple took a seat by the window, holding hands like teenagers. Omar felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the kind of place it should have always been. A place where everyone was welcome. A few days later, Omar received an unexpected call. Mr. Rahman, this is Lisa Carter from the Daily Journal. We'd love to do a feature on your restaurant and its transformation. Omar raised an eyebrow. A feature? Yes. Your story has made waves online. People want to hear directly from you, about the buyout, the changes, and what this all means to you. Omar smiled. I'd be honored. A week later, the article was published. From Hate to Hope: How One Family Turned Discrimination into a Business Success Story. Heavy Checkmark detailed how Omar had taken over the restaurant. Heavy Checkmark exposed Craig's discrimination and downfall. Heavy Checkmark highlighted how Iron Grill had become a symbol of change. The response? Massive. Heavy Checkmark other business owners reached out, inspired to follow Omar's example. Heavy Checkmark activists praised his leadership. Heavy Checkmark even people who had once ignored discrimination realized the power of standing up. And then, the unexpected happened. One afternoon, as Omar was reviewing schedules in his office, a staff member knocked. Sir, there's someone asking to see you. Omar looked up. Who? He wouldn't say his name. Omar frowned, but curiosity got the best of him. He stepped out into the dining area, and stopped. Sitting at a table near the back looking out of place was Craig Henshaw. Omar's stomach tightened, but his face remained unreadable. He walked over. Craig looked up, his expression different. No sneer. No arrogance. Just tiredness. Omar slid into the seat across from him. Craig? Craig exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Didn't think you'd sit down? Omar leaned back. Didn't think you'd come back. Craig let out a small, bitter chuckle. Guess we're both full of surprises. A pause stretched between them. Finally, Craig sighed. I lost everything, Rahman. His voice was quiet, almost hollow. My job. My reputation. My savings. No one will hire me. No one will even look at me. I didn't think it would go this far. Omar's gaze was steady. Did you think you could treat people the way you did and face no consequences? Craig shook his head. I thought I was just protecting what was mine. Omar exhaled. It was never yours, Craig. You just had the illusion of power. Craig rubbed his hands together, looking down. I guess I see that now. Omar remained silent, studying the man who had once tried to humiliate his family. Craig cleared his throat. I came to say, I was wrong. Omar's eyebrows lifted slightly. Go on. Craig's fingers drummed against the table. I thought people like you were just here to take things away from people like me. His voice wavered slightly. But I was the one doing the taking, wasn't I? Omar nodded slowly. I guess I deserved what happened, Craig admitted. I guess. I just needed to hear myself say it. For the first time, Omar saw something real in Craig's eyes. Not manipulation. Not arrogance. Just regret. Omar folded his hands together. And now what? Craig chuckled bitterly. Now, I don't know. Maybe try to rebuild something. If that's even possible. Silence again. Then Omar spoke. You want advice, Craig? Craig nodded. Omar leaned in. Stop looking for power. Start looking for purpose. Craig held his gaze for a long moment. Then finally he nodded. I'll try. Omar stood. Good. Craig looked around one last time, then stood as well. Goodbye, Rahman. Goodbye, Craig. And with that, Craig Henshaw walked out of Iron Grill, this time for the last time. As Omar returned to his office, he found himself exhaling deeply. Layla stood at the door, arms crossed. That looked intense. Omar chuckled. It was. She tilted her head. And, did he apologize? Omar smiled slightly. In his own way. Layla studied him. Do you think he'll change? Omar sighed. That's up to him. She nodded, stepping closer. And you? Do you feel closure? Omar considered the question. Then after a moment he smiled. Yes, I do. That night, Omar sat outside looking up at the stars. Sanaa walked out and plopped down beside him. So what now, Baba? Omar smirked. Why do you always ask me that? She grinned. Because I know you. You're always thinking of the next move. Omar chuckled. You're too smart for your own good. Sanaa leaned back. Come on, tell me. Omar exhaled, looking ahead. Maybe we open another restaurant? Sanaa's eyes widened. Another Iron Grill? Omar shook his head. No. Something different. Something even bigger. Sanaa laughed. You're addicted to this, aren't you? Omar grinned. Maybe. Sanaa rested her head against his shoulder. Whatever it is, Baba. I know it's going to be amazing. Omar smiled. Because deep down he knew she was right. Omar sat in his home office, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug as he stared out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a true sense of peace. The past few months had been a whirlwind, buying the restaurant, transforming its culture, exposing Craig, and dealing with the inevitable backlash. But now the dust had settled. Iron Grill was thriving, his family was happy, and most importantly, he had proven that integrity always outlasts hate. As he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. For a brief moment he considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. He picked up. "This is Omar Rahman?" Pause. Then a hesitant voice on the other end. "Mr. Rahman, this is Craig." Omar's fingers stilled against the mug. He hadn't expected to hear from Craig Henshaw again, not after their last conversation at the restaurant. He straightened in his seat. "Craig?" Craig cleared his throat. "Look, I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. And I wouldn't blame you if you just hung up right now. But I needed to call." Omar remained silent, giving him space to speak. Craig sighed, and for the first time his voice didn't hold resentment. It held something else. Defeat, maybe. Regret. "I've been trying to find work. Nobody will hire me. I spent so long thinking I was better than everyone else, and now I don't even know who I am without that damn job." His voice cracked slightly. "I know I messed up, Rahman. I know I don't deserve anything from you, least of all forgiveness. But I need to find a way to move forward." Omar exhaled slowly. He had expected many things from Craig. Anger, stubbornness, maybe even one last bitter insult. But not this. Not a broken man at the end of his rope, realizing too late that he had built his life on the wrong foundation. "Craig," Omar said, his voice steady, "I told you last time, you need to stop looking for power and start looking for purpose. Have you done that?" A bitter laugh came through the receiver. "I don't even know where to start." Omar glanced at the framed family photo on his desk. "You start by accepting that you aren't owed anything. That moving forward won't happen overnight. That redemption, if you want it, is earned, not asked for." Silence stretched between them. Then Craig sighed. Yeah, I get that." Omar wasn't sure what made him say it, but the words came naturally. "There's a homeless shelter a few blocks from Iron Grill. They run employment programs for people trying to rebuild their lives. If you're serious about starting over, go there. Volunteer. Learn something about humility. And when you're ready, see where life takes you." Craig hesitated. "You really think they'd want someone like me?" "That's up to you, isn't it?" Omar replied. Another long silence. Then Craig murmured, "Thanks, Rahman." Omar nodded, though Craig couldn't see him. "Good luck, Craig." And with that he hung up. For a while he sat there, staring at his phone, processing what had just happened. He knew he had no obligation to help Craig. The man had brought his downfall upon himself. But if there was one thing Omar believed in, it was that people, no matter how flawed, had the capacity to change. Whether Craig would or not, that was beyond his control. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Layla standing at the doorway, her arms crossed, an amused smile on her lips. "You're thinking too hard," she said. Omar chuckled. "Habit?" She stepped closer, perching on the edge of his desk. "What was that about?" "Craig," he admitted. Layla's eyebrows lifted. "And?" Omar leaned back, rubbing his chin. "And I think he might finally understand what he lost." Layla studied him for a moment before nodding. "Some people need to hit rock bottom before they realize they built their house on sand." "Exactly," Omar murmured. She reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "You did what you had to do. And now it's over?" Omar let out a slow breath. "Yeah, it's over." And for the first time he truly believed it. The next few weeks were peaceful. Iron Grill continued to thrive, new customers pouring in daily, the restaurant becoming more than just a business. It had become a symbol of inclusivity and resilience. Omar spent more time at home, enjoying family dinners, catching up on books he had neglected, and for the first time in years, considering what came next. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Sanaa tapped her fingers against her glass thoughtfully. "Baba, I've been thinking." Omar raised an eyebrow. "That's dangerous." She rolled her eyes playfully. "I'm serious. You've turned Iron Grill into a success, right? And you always say that businesses should serve the community." "Go on," Omar said, intrigued. She leaned forward. "What if we start a foundation? Something that helps small businesses owned by minorities or people facing discrimination. We could offer funding, mentorship, resources, help them get a real shot." Omar blinked, then slowly smiled. "You've been planning this, haven't you?" Sanaa shrugged. "Maybe a little." Layla beamed. That's an incredible idea. Omar considered it. He had spent his life building businesses, creating wealth, proving people like Craig wrong. But maybe it was time for something bigger. Something that wasn't about proving a point but about making a lasting impact. He looked at his daughter, pride swelling in his chest. Let's do it? Sanaa grinned. Really? Really? Ayan, ever the enthusiastic one, bounced in his seat. Can I help? Omar laughed. Absolutely. As they continued discussing ideas, Layla placed a hand over Omar's. See? You didn't just change one restaurant. You're about to change lives. Omar squeezed her hand in return. That was always the goal. He glanced out the window at the world beyond their home, at the city that had challenged him, tried to break him, but ultimately made him stronger. There would always be people like Craig Henshaw, people who clung to hate because it was easier than growth. But there would also always be people like Omar Rahman, people who saw injustice, refused to accept it, and built something better in its place. And that was the difference. That was why people like him would always win. With a deep breath, Omar leaned back in his chair, taking in the laughter of his family, the warmth of the home they had built, and the endless possibilities ahead. The fight was over. The future had just begun.